Hello, and welcome to today's webinar presented by McGraw-Hill Education, Strategies for Aligning Pre-K to 12 Literacy Initiatives with Higher Order Expectations. My name is Jeff Omer, Senior National Literacy Curriculum Specialist with McGraw-Hill Education, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Like many pre-K to 12 literacy leaders, you may be rethinking your initiative surrounding providing the ELA instruction required for every student to be future ready. Many forces are creating opportunities for literacy leaders to advancing their ELA curricula to ensure instruction and assessment are consistent, coherent, rigorous, and relevant. In today's webinar, we will discover some frameworks and strategies for enhancing school and district literacy initiatives. Before we begin, let's review some of the technical aspects of today's presentation. Please check the audio settings on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please see the detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resources list beneath the Q&A window. There are some other icons located at the bottom of the webinar console that open additional feature panels. You can read about today's speakers in the speaker bio panel and access the resource list to download a copy of today's slides. To submit a question for the experts to answer during the Q&A session, please type them in the Q&A box located above the resource list window. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archived and free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Joining us today are Dr. Douglas Fisher and Shawn Mahoney. Dr. Douglas Fisher is a professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a teacher leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. He is a member of the California Reading Hall of Fame and the recipient of an International Reading Association Celebrate Literacy Award and many others. He has published numerous books and articles on improving student achievement. He is a board member of the International Reading Association and a past board member of the Literacy Research Association. And Dr. Shawn Mahoney is the Chief Academic Officer for McGraw-Hill Education. Dr. Mahoney and her team are focused on the academic design and academic integrity for awesome learning experiences, including the strategy for learning outcomes within the McGraw-Hill Education digital learning system. Shawn's previous positions include the VP of School Product Design Research and Efficacy, and she was a co-founder of the IDEA Innovation Center. With that, we'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Fisher for his portion of the webinar.
Hello, and thanks for everybody for being here. I thought I'd talk about components of a comprehensive literacy plan, at least in the area of getting kids to read complex text. And there's my website on the slide there, fisherandfry.com. You are welcome to contact me. There's all kinds of PowerPoints that you're welcome to use if that is helpful for you. So I'm going to start off with a conversation around rigor. I assume you've all heard of rigor. People talk about rigor. People worry about rigor. One of the things I love to do in a longer teacher workshop is have everybody write down, what is your definition of rigor? And it humors me because it's such a mess, because people really don't have a good sense of what they mean when they say rigor. And that's an important conversation. We're all using this word, but we don't always know what we mean by it. A lot of people write to me, you know it when you see it. Well, I don't think that's very helpful in determining and designing literacy experiences for our students. So I'd like to propose that rigor is a very complex relationship or negotiation between difficulty and complexity. That as teachers, we have to balance both difficulty and complexity. And as we design comprehensive literacy efforts for school systems, we think about how and when students should be engaged in difficult tasks versus complex tasks. And the way I think about difficulty is how much effort, how much time, how much work you have to put forth. Versus complexity is how much thinking, how many steps or how many actions, and how much background knowledge. Both are necessary, but if we only define rigor as difficulty and we just make things difficult for students and call that rigorous, they're not going to like us or our classes very much. We have to think about both of these and balance them as we design learning experiences for students. Let me give you a couple examples. These are released items from Park. Here's a part of a question from Park. Take a look at this question. And I would argue in this question there's not much complexity, but there is some difficulty. Some students will find this difficult. If I gave this item to second graders, it would be more difficult than if I gave it to 10th graders. If I gave this item to English learners, it would be more difficult than if I gave it to kids who were proficient in English. This item scales on difficulty, but doesn't get more complex. Here's another item, also released from Park. And I would argue this item has more complexity, but isn't very difficult. So if you take a look at this, if you know how to estimate, and you know about ratios, and you can use process of elimination, those three cognitive things, you can get this answer right without using a calculator. So this item scales more on complexity for me than on difficulty. And as I've been thinking about this, I ran across this newspaper article about this guy named Mark who's fascinated with the number pi. And he has memorized and he can recite pi to 15,314 digits. I think the logical question is why you would want to do that. But my question to you is your community or your parents or your students or the teachers in that community more enamored when students do difficult things or complex things? And do you need a little PR campaign to let people know that they should value, celebrate, and recognize when students do complex things, not just difficult things? And as we've been thinking about this, we started looking at the 4 quadrants that could be created by low difficulty, low complexity, high difficulty, low complexity, and so on. And as we've been thinking about the tasks and assignments that teachers can give, we started thinking about the range of things that need to happen for students. Some of the tasks that students have are low difficulty, low complexity. They build the students' fluency. That could be procedural fluency, conceptual fluency, automaticity, things that happen automatically. They're within the habits of students. The low quadrant is not a bad place to be, but it can't be the only place that students work. They need to work in the other 3 quadrants as well. Fluency activities, things that build your habits or your automaticity, are important in building stamina, rigor, high expectations for students. We also need some things that really push on the stamina side of this. We have to raise the difficulty but keep the complexity low so that we can stretch students' stamina. And as you think about this, things that require stamina today with practice tomorrow, the next day, start moving more into the fluency quadrant. When you become more skilled, things are less difficult and they move toward the fluency quadrant. The goal is to push everything into fluency or automaticity so that we are freeing up working memory for other kinds of things. In the top left quadrant, we have the strategic thinking. It's not very difficult, but there's more complexity. So slowing down, thinking intentionally, really processing, being metacognitively aware, planning, being strategic in your note-taking, all those kinds of strategic thinking tasks that are super important for students. And the last quadrant we call the expertise quadrant. Some people call it mastery, some people call it proficiency. We ended up calling it expertise. Some tasks that we give students should be highly difficult and highly complex. And for close reading is an example of an expertise task. And over time, when you have things working in the expertise quadrant, really difficult, really complex, if they start learning, it starts to move over into the strategic thinking side, and then slowly out of the strategic thinking quadrant into the fluency quadrant. Our goal is to develop habits that students can transfer class to class, day to day, week to week, year to year. So when we think about the range of tasks in a unit of study, we need some tasks that require fluency, some tasks that require stamina, some tasks that require strategic thinking, and some that build students' expertise. All of them are important in how we think about the concept of rigor. So as we build our comprehensive literacy plans, we have to think about, is this the appropriate level of rigor, and what are the tasks that I can assign students to get there? So I thought we'd take a little poll. Which area in your classroom or classrooms or school or district, whatever your sphere of influence is, which area do you think needs more attention? Do you need to work more on fluency? Do you need to work more on stamina, strategic thinking, or expertise? Choose one of those. And let's see. Oh, interesting. Strategic thinking. That's awesome. Yeah, I agree. And every time I do this, I keep thinking about, like, in my own practice, where do I need to go right now? And one of the things I've been thinking about now is I got to get my students, their stamina up a little bit more, because they're getting tired and it's that point of the year and they're giving up on stuff. But a lot of you have talked about strategic thinking, being more metacognitively aware, being more planful, intentional. There's no one right answer to this. It's about us being able to reflect, where am I working with students, where are the gaps, and how can I close those gaps and build all 4 of these processes with students. As we've been thinking about a comprehensive literacy initiative, Nancy Fry and I have been talking about the ways in which students can access complex text. So as part of your overall initiative for raising achievement in reading, here are things that I think a lot about in the world of complex text. How can we get students into complex text? And there are 5 access points. We're going to go through them in varying amounts of time. So the first I'd like to talk about is purpose and modeling. Do teachers communicate what students are supposed to be learning, and do they model their thinking for students? When I think about purpose, we should focus on what students are learning rather than the task, assignment, or activity. I've been on a lot of walkthroughs in my career, and most of the time a principal on a walkthrough will ask a randomly selected kid, "What are you doing?" And the student will answer with a task in front of them. And I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the right question to ask a student is, what are you learning? We should elevate that. What are you learning today, not what are you doing today? Because we want kids to understand that school is about learning, and here are the things you are learning. Now, we've all heard about objectives. It's not the first time and you didn't come on this webinar to hear about objectives, but teachers should know what they want their kids to learn. And if you think back to your own teacher school days, you heard about SMART objectives, being specific and measurable. And my reflection on that is they forgot interesting. A lot of the objectives that are taught are boring, and students don't know why they're learning it. We have to be able to say, here's why we're learning what we are learning. I've done a lot of work in our local community around this idea of purpose, like what are you learning and why are you learning it? And we've evolved that work into these 3 questions that we believe students should be able to answer every single day. For every lesson, students should be able to say, what am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I have learned it? That is one of the access points, because when they can answer these 3 questions, they're paying way more attention and they are way more engaged in their learning. If they can't answer these questions, they might be learning other things. They might be not paying attention. They might disengage from the learning. Student ownership, student responsibility, student voice. We've got to have students take responsibility for, what am I learning today? Why am I learning this? How will I know I've learned it? That then influences what the teachers have to say in the class. The teachers have to make the learning expectations clear. They have to talk about relevance, and they have to talk about success criteria. How will students know when something has been learned? That's only one tiny bit of our access perspective, but without being clear on what we want teachers and students to learn and what success looks like, a lot of students aren't learning it. And I thought we'd ask, what is the status of purpose-driven instruction in your classroom, school, or district? Do all students know what they're supposed to be learning and why? Do they know what success looks like? Do they think about this? Does it drive the instruction? I still see a lot of compliance. I see a lot of districts making up rules that there has to be an objective posted on the wall. I don't see it as a commitment that this drives students' learning. I think a lot about this. Where are we in the status of being very purposeful, intentional, and clear? How well is this happening? A few years ago in our district, I would have said non-existent. I would have said this does not happen. And we're becoming really, really good. We've become very strong at this. Let's see where you all are. Mostly moderate, and a bunch of people weak. I'm not surprised by this. We've kind of lost the attention on purpose-driven instruction. And I hear a lot of teachers say, oh, I don't want to write a lesson plan. I don't write objectives. I did that when I was in teacher school. I don't know how to teach well, much less assess well, if I don't know what I want students to learn. And I think there's an equity issue. If I'm not communicating what the learning targets are and what success looks like, I'm leaving a whole bunch of students behind. So one of the access points that we argue is, when students don't know what the purpose is, they are unlikely to learn it. I jump down to wide independent reading. Another way to get students into complex text is to get them reading a lot. Reading volume still matters. There's still a lot of evidence, mostly correlational, but there's a lot of evidence that when students read a lot, they achieve a lot more. Here's some of the evidence. This is correlational research. Again, it's not causation, but I think it illustrates some issues that we might have in our comprehensive literacy plan. A student who reads 20 minutes a day reads 1.8 million words, and that student will reliably score in the 90th percentile. Interestingly, that student who reads 1.8 million words learns about 2,700 new vocabulary words each year. And if you work with students who have a vocabulary gap from the time they arrive, that is a highly effective way of closing that vocabulary gap, getting them to read a lot. Student B reads 5 minutes on average per day. That student's volume drops to 282,000 words a year, and that student scores in the 50th percentile. That student learns between 800 and 900 new words a year. So we went from 2,700 words down to 800 to 900 words. We're seeing a huge drop in volume of reading, in achievement, and in vocabulary knowledge. And student C reads on average 1 minute a day, reads 8,000 words in a year, scores in the bottom 10th percentile, and learns no new words for the year. I'm not suggesting that just getting kids to read is the answer for a comprehensive literacy program. But I do think if students don't practice what they've been taught, they're never going to be good at it. I've been thinking about Malcolm Gladwell's work of late. He talks about the 10,000 hours of practice. If students don't engage in enough practice, I'm not sure how the instruction will ever stick. That's what my worry is on this volume of reading. We have to teach really well, but then students have to practice in things they can read to build their background knowledge, to build their vocabulary, and to build their habits. So for you, as a reflection, what is the status of wide reading in your classroom, school, or district? Do students have opportunities to engage in reading? And I don't necessarily mean reading during the school day. You know, there's a lot of work about having students read outside of the school day, getting that volume time in. So how much are students reading? Or is this an area that as you design your comprehensive school or district literacy plan, you need to think about the practice effect of having students read? We do know statistically that students spend fewer minutes actually reading now than they did 10 years ago. Grown-ups, by the way, read less now than they did 10 years ago. It's just we're seeing a decline, a steady decline in total reading volume. And that's troubling because reading helps us think about the world, think about empathy, develop empathy, and to understand complex interactions. Let's see what you all said. I'm happy to see that so many of you, or nearly 20% of you, have a strong, fully implemented wide reading program. And then I think that's mostly what I see is it's some moderate levels of implementation, and maybe we need to resuscitate our wide reading efforts. The next access point is one that gets a lot of attention. It's that close and scaffolded reading, getting students into close reading. I suspect most of you have heard of close reading. It's super popular right now. It's an important aspect of how we think about reading instruction today. When I think about close reading, I'll make a connection to the Common Core standards. I'm aware that not all of you live and work in locations that are influenced by Common Core. But the standard is really about reading complex literary and informational text by yourself and doing that proficiently. We're trying to get kids into more complex text than they read on their own. And before I talk too much about close reading, I'd just like to remind you that that's not the only thing we do in the classroom. We use less complex text to build students' stamina and more complex text when we're building their strength. I'm talking right now about strength training, but remember we've already talked about wide reading. We've got to build both stamina and strength. I've been on walkthroughs where principals asked, what's the lexile level of that book you're using to teach? And I don't think that's the right question. Just knowing the lexile is not enough for me. I'd like to know, were you working on stamina or were you working on strength? And is that text the right text to do that? I think that's a more robust question. I think there's a difference between assigning a complex text and teaching a complex text. My well-meaning ninth grade teacher assigned us Beowulf. She didn't teach it to us. She assigned it to us, and then each day we would have a comprehension quiz over the chapter or the section from the night before. There's a difference between teaching a complex text and assigning it. If I look at the Common Core standards again, make a connection there, we're trying to get kids to read closely, to determine what the text says explicitly, and to make logical inferences, cite evidence, and then draw conclusions. That's what we're trying to accomplish with this instructional routine. For close reading, we're looking at short passages. We're looking at having students read things, shorter passages, so they can apply these instructional and cognitive strategies. We also ask students to engage in rereading. In the primary grades, K1-2, we tend to have the teacher be the rereader in a lot of the close readings, but the students direct where the rereading occurs. By late second grade, certainly by third grade, the students are doing the rereading. But I know a lot of you have a lot of students who don't like to reread. Nancy and I watched 100 classroom observations last year, and we looked specifically at how highly effective teachers got their students to reread. And here's a few things we learned. If you change the task, for example, the first time you say, could you read this for the flow? The second time you say, could you read for annotation? Or you ask a really good question, or you press students for evidence. When you do those three things, change the task, ask a really good question, or press for evidence, students are way more likely to go back and reread. I get a lot of messages from people who try close reading and say, my students won't reread. Well, if there's no reason to reread it, they're not going to. When we get these reasons out there, students are more likely to engage in repeated reading. The third area we look for is text-dependent questions. Is reading with the pencil, annotation. Text-dependent questions are coming in a second. Is having students learn how to annotate, either digitally or on paper pencil. Interacting with the text and slowing it down and marking right on the text. We are now recommending 3 what we call foundational annotation skills. And you don't have to have 3. You can make it 4 if you wanted. You could choose 1 or 2 different than us. Here are the things we chose to go deeper so students would develop a habit, and then they could annotate additional tools on their own. So we looked for consistency for these 3 in San Diego so that teachers would know what they're seeing in their students. We asked students to underline key ideas so that teachers can walk the room and see if students are understanding the central or key ideas in a text. We ask kids to circle words and phrases that are confusing or unclear so that the teacher can take an inventory of where the misunderstandings are. And we ask students to write margin notes where they restate their own thinking of the author's ideas. These are 3 habits. Now, you could have a 4. Lots of people like to ask questions. But after that, we don't have to go to 12 different annotation things. We should have students design their own annotations beyond these simple or foundational ones that students are engaged with. As I said earlier, annotation can occur digitally or in a printed text. We can annotate on screen or on paper, but marking the text becomes important. In the primary grades, we see a lot of WikiStick annotation. Students are marking the text with the WikiStick. It doesn't ruin the book. It doesn't leave a mark. It shows the teacher what the student was thinking. You can bend them around words. You can underline them with words. You can cut them. We're thinking about how to help students mark places in the text. And then with older students, we're seeing, I'm not a huge fan of the highlighter. I put this in to say that, but some teachers like highlighters. I find that if students have a highlighter, they won't mark the text on the first read because they know they're going to understand it in a different way in subsequent readings. So I don't love the highlighter, but I wanted to remember to say this. Please have people collect the annotations. Annotations are amazing formative assessment data. They are great fodder for professional learning conversations. They show us what students were thinking during reading, not just after reading. I think they're great data to take a look at students' understanding of process and of content. Too often we see them, annotations leave the room. They were a great assessment opportunity that got missed. The fourth component is the text-dependent question, asking questions that drive the reader back into the text to look for evidence. We've built a text-dependent question model. Nancy and I have been thinking about this a lot. And we took the reading standards and we organized them into those 6 categories you see in the middle. Those 6 categories help us think about the content of the questions. But they're not very useful for a student-facing side. So we ended up with the 3 questions on the left side as what we're teaching students how to think about a text, because we want this to become their own habits individually, independently. So when students encounter a text when they're by themselves, the first thing they should do is think about what the text says. What does the text say? Now, the kinds of questions we ask them are about general understanding and key details. Over time, we say, how does this text work? And that's where we move into craft and structure and vocabulary and purpose kinds of questions. And then we move into the inferential side. What does the text mean? Where they ask logical inferences, where they look at opinions and arguments, and the connections of this text to other text. It's a journey we take readers on. We start at literal, we move to structural, we move to inferential. There's a triangle behind that for a reason. We need lots and lots of what does the text say literal questions in our back pocket, because those answers are typically short, and if we don't get students at the literal level, they won't be able to make inferences. So we tend to write a lot of literal questions, but we might not use them all in a class, in a session, because you never know what next year's or the years after kids are going to need, and we ask questions at the literal level to avoid telling students what to think about the text. So if I know I have another detailed question, or I know I have another general understanding question, I am less likely to tell students what to think. That's why we have so many of those questions. Inference and opinion questions, you don't need very many because the answers are way longer. Students like to talk about those, but we have no evidence that students can make an inference on a piece of text they don't understand. The next access point is the conversation. And the connection here is those questions we ask should be talked about by students. That's the point of this. Is the reason we generate all these questions is not for students to fill out a worksheet, but to have collaborative conversations, dialogue with each other so they can come to a better understanding. Talking about complex text with peers helps us all understand it. Collaborative conversations are required. I think we need to say if the students are not talking to each other, they're probably not engaged in a true close reading lesson. Another poll for you. What percentage of instructional minutes do you believe should be devoted to student-to-student interaction? How much of the time, each week, how much of the time should be spent with students engaged in interaction, academic language, student-to-student interactions? Take a few more seconds to let you all click in. And we see lots of percentages, high percentages. 50 and 75 are the highest. In our school system, we request that 50% of the minutes averaged over a week are student-to-student interaction. We try so hard to spend significant amounts of time with students who are talking to each other, interacting using academic language. And there's a standard, for those of you who live in Common Core locations, there's a standard for this. And it helps us think about what students need to do in Speaking and Listening Standard 1. For those of you who don't live in a Common Core location, the idea remains the same. How do we get kids talking to each other? So I'm going to show you rapidly a few different grade bands of what the standard is asking for. And I don't think it's just limited to the Common Core standards. These are good practices. In the primary grades, we're asking students to follow the rules of a discussion. They need to learn what a discussion is like. They have to move from participation to actual turn-taking, where they don't just put their stuff out and then disengage from the group. They actually take turns and actively listen. And they sustain discussions through questioning, all of these occurring with adult support. In grades 3 to 5, it's the same three major points with adult support. Plus, we add that they are prepared for the discussion, they know how to yield and gain the floor, they pose and respond to questions, and they move from explaining their own ideas to explaining the ideas of other people. These are important things that will benefit our society. It's just not a Common Core thing, it's an all of us thing. In grades 6 to 8, they have evidence, they have collegial discussions that include goals and deadlines, they ask questions across multiple speakers, and they acknowledge new information as it comes in. In grades 9 and 10, we're asking them to use prepared research, to have formal decision-making like voting and consensus reaching and things like that, to make sure they hear a full range of options and opinions. That might mean they have to ask other members of their group what their thinking is if that member didn't talk. And they summarize and synthesize the points where they disagree, not just where they agreed. And then in grades 11 and 12, they have civil and democratic discussions and dialogues. They have questions that probe reasoning and evidence. They resolve contradictions, and they figure out what they still need to know. This takes a long time to teach. It's the whole continuum from kindergarten through 12th grade to really have strong collaborative conversations where you understand the perspective of other people, where you learn how to add your own. And as I've been thinking about this, if we're trying to get students into more rigorous texts by doing more rigorous tasks, where are the gaps? Are we strong in our purpose? Are we strong in our teacher modeling? Are we strong in close reading lessons? Are we strong in collaborative conversations? Do students read a lot? And do we know how to build strong formative assessments so that we notice which students have mastered content and which students still need to be taught? That's the needs assessment that I think we all need to be doing. Our current work at my own school, we're very strong on purpose and teacher modeling. We're really good at it. Close reading is one of our signatures. Our students talk a lot. We have very focused on the 50%. We're still working on getting kids to read a lot. They read at school, and we know they read at school because we have all these close readings, and we have reading logs, and we have discussions, one-on-one discussions with them, but they're not reading as much outside of school. So our needs assessment, in part, is around having students read more outside of school. That's the next phase of our literacy comprehensive plan. And then formative assessments. We're trying to figure out what kinds of assessments we need that could link with our summative assessments. How will we track and notice where students are needing us and where we need to go with them? So I hope that as you think about these 5 access points, there are places where you're experiencing some success, and there are places where you're thinking, I might need to make a tweak, a change. I need to go investigate. I don't know schools where all 5 of these are non-existent, but I do know in different places there are different needs to build a comprehensive, strong literacy plan. I'm going to pause there. I want to thank you for your time. I'll hang out and answer questions in a little bit. If you want the website again, it's fisherandfry.com. You are welcome to contact me and follow up with clarifying questions if we don't have time to do it in this live webinar. For now, I'll turn it over to Jeff, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. That was fantastic. And I want to thank everyone else that's on the call so far for the great questions. Please keep the questions coming in. We will address those at the end of the webinar today. So I'm going to pass it off now to Shawn Mahoney and give her a little bit of time. Shawn?
Thank you so much, Jeff. I want to also start by expressing my gratitude to Doug. Thank you very much, Dr. Fisher. I know I'm always impressed with the way that you're able to translate research into really pragmatic and actionable ways to impact instruction. So thank you very much. I also wanted to thank EdWeek for the platform for professional discourse and learning. And I think it's also important to thank the folks that are on the line. As a former classroom teacher and literacy specialist, I deeply appreciate the competing interests on your time. So I'm grateful that you've devoted this hour to spend with us, and really hopeful that if you're able to walk away with one new notion that informs your thinking about literacy, or one new idea about how to approach implementation, or even a story that allows you to sort of lead yourself and your organization through change effectively, then we'll call that a success. By way of discussion, I wanted to put the context and the notion of literacy into a bit of perspective as I think about it and as our organization at McGraw-Hill Education thinks about it on a daily basis. So as you can see on screen, our focus is on learning. Our vision is to unlock the full potential of each learner, and our mission is to do that through intuitive, engaging, efficient, and effective experiences. And incredibly importantly, that's grounded in research. So you heard Doug talk about purpose. We are driven by purpose. We often talk about purposeful learning and the power of great teaching. So if you will indulge me just a bit, I would like to share a brief story that I found to be helpful in thinking about this work more broadly. Seeing a cup and bowl of soup here, and as the story sort of goes, a gentleman walks in to a restaurant to order lunch, order soup. Soup's delivered to the table, and when the waiter returns, the gentleman is looking at the soup and he says, "Is everything okay?" And he says, I can't eat this soup." So the waiter apologizes profusely, disappears, takes the soup in the back of the restaurant, brings out a new bowl from the kitchen, returns it to the customer, and the customer looks at him and says, "I can't eat this soup." So the waiter goes and finds the manager and explains that something's really wrong with the soup, and his attempts at service are clearly not helping. So the manager walks over and apologizes again and states that he understands something's wrong with the soup, and the customer simply looks up at him and he says, "I can't eat the soup because I don't have a spoon." And the reason why I think of this in this context is oftentimes as educators, it is a lesson from one of my teachers and leaders about context and really understanding how you define a problem determines all of the solutions that your mind can't consider. And so when we're thinking about effective literacy initiatives, effective literacy instruction, it's paramount to have a common understanding of the problem that we're facing in our own particular context so that we can consider the best solutions. And that holds true when we're thinking about literacy initiatives, and I would argue beyond. So it's not just about, in our perspective, having the right tool or the right strategy, but it's around the right tools and the right strategies at the right time for the right student for the right purpose and the right reason. This is really about the purpose of literacy. And so as my teams and I approach this work, we're incredibly focused on learning and specifically on purposeful learning, as I mentioned. And for us, that's a focus on how learning happens and how the mind develops. And in our experience, learning and learning and that teaching and learning cycle is optimized when science meets art. And so this is the place where the science of learning meets the art of teaching. And we do ask those deep questions about what are you learning? And as Doug mentioned, why are you learning that? And it's incredibly important. So we have an entire team of folks, learning experts. These are former teachers, and actually my team prefers that I use this version of the slide. I think they look handsome in both. But they will describe themselves as former teachers. They are cognitive psychologists. We have experts in language acquisition. And they come together and are uniquely positioned to think about how we design our instructional materials across all ages and stages of learning. So quite honestly, one of the draws for this particular role for me at McGraw-Hill Education is that we can look pre-K through 12 at all subjects in a way that embeds research about literacy in strategic ways that impacts all of the classrooms across disciplines. And we believe that design thinking and iterative design, how we approach solving a problem or improving a solution is critical in education. And we also believe that iterative design has to be paired with research throughout the life cycle. So it's not just design intentions, but it's how we iterate on research intentions as well, how we gather evidence or learn something new about a phenomenon in the literacy space. So we approach the design and development of our literacy solutions with this intent around comprehensive and rigorous methodology that's in service of pedagogy, right? It's about leading with the learning. And so what you're seeing on screen here is actually a life cycle that we've developed that we utilize for all of our development. And in the middle, kind of starting with that purple circle, from left to right, it's the standard phases of any design. So you go from the point where you think you are exploring how to discover a solution in a problem space all the way to the right-hand side around implementation and evaluation. And anybody who's familiar with instructional design, this has similarities to the ADDIE model, for example. And above that cycle are all of the different types of research that we conduct at various phases. And then we pair that with the object under scrutiny. So we might be looking at an approach to metacognition or an approach to differentiating instruction for English language learners. And we pair that object under scrutiny with where we are moving left from right, design or implementation, with a methodology that's appropriate so that we can gather the evidence that validates, or in some cases invalidates that approach, but allows us to iterate. So there's a couple of examples that I often share. One is really coming from quantitative research that we do, and what you're seeing on screen is not something you have to read. It's just intended to show the complexity of what's happening in some of the quantitative analysis. So what you're seeing at the top of the screen is actually this blue box with an equation. And if you go straight down to the bottom of the screen, there's a box in green with the solution. And essentially what's happening in that middle path is where you see how most students, or we would predict most students, would actually arrive at an accurate solution. What's happening on the edges and on the fringes are all of the valid ways to go from that blue box to the green box, or that equation to the solution. And this is one example where we're using our research to really be humble about what technology can afford and support by way of classroom experience. So how can we utilize technology to help us address and accommodate students on the fringes who are really approaching work and learning in creative problem-solving types of ways. On the other hand, what you're seeing on this screen is some qualitative research that we conduct. This is actually from a session in a methodology that we've labeled Kids Community. And we bring in students on Saturdays, and we work with our researchers and our design experts. And this is actually one of our user experience designers on the right here. And she's in a design session with a student focusing on an elementary lesson in mathematics. And I share this by way of context because literacy, like all other types of learning in our mind, has to be purposeful. And we have to understand the nature of the problem so that we can consider the right solutions grounded in research. And that purpose comes from asking the learners, just like we ask ourselves, what am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know when I've learned it? That's true as we design and develop as well. So when we think about literacy and the purpose of literacy learning in the broader context, we often start with this notion about it's a way for us to exchange information. Story was the vehicle for us to exchange information about ourselves. And that the answer to sort of truth and understanding the world around you and being literate in the world around you and the zeitgeist beyond your time was that exchange of story and information. And what keeps the flame of knowing and literacy alive is this network of knowledge. It's knowledge of self and knowledge of others and knowledge of the world. So we think about literacy in any subject from math to science or economics to literature about as a way for you to better understand yourself. And the more that you can do that, the more you can learn and grow and contribute to the world beyond you. So literacy is really this process of interaction between the self and the text. And it's a powerful vehicle for developing the skills and strategies and ways of being that we heard Doug talk about, critical thinking and communication. And it is our stance that without thought and analysis and communication, there's this breakdown of understanding. And literacy is the thing that cures that fatal ailment, right? Literacy is the thing that helps us understand ourselves and the world around us in context. And so its importance cannot be underestimated, nor should it be limited to the written word. So we're committed to helping people understand themselves better in their own time and making meaning and seeing that as the essence of learning and literacy, which brings us back to this notion of knowing yourself, knowing your mind, and how your own learning experience happens. So for us, it's really about focusing on that process of inquiry. And we've talked to several experts in our work. So in the field, we'll often hold teacher advisory boards. We'll bring in subject matter experts. And when we had a conversation about literacy, and I said, we're working on a webinar right now, and imagine that you had 400 to 600 educators across the country. What would you say is the role of an educator as it relates to literacy? This is coming from a district director who worked in a large urban area. She said, the educator's the critical mediator and the guide, and this is a direct quote. Students come to school sometimes confident or sometimes uncertain with a range of understanding of, quote, text, unquote. As educators, we unpack this text to support their ability to understand and broaden their process of interaction with the self and text. So we've thought about this work and started to frame it up as some essential questions around this act of inquiry as we design and develop and as we've seen other schools and districts design and develop their comprehensive literacy plan. And the essential questions we've broken into kind of 5 categories. And the first one is, what's the common and transparent, clearly communicated definition of literacy? So the takeaway here is that a common language drives a common vision. And we heard this with Doug, right? He said, when I often ask educators to write down the definition of rigor, I get a multiplicity of perspective. So really having and driving that common language helps drive a common vision. The second essential question is around naming and framing the parts of your system. So how have you communicated the essential elements of your literacy ecosystem? Third question is really about observation and adaptation. So what's your theory of action, right? How are you embarking on this literacy journey, and how are you monitoring that journey on an ongoing basis against your success criteria? The fourth question is what we sometimes call the who can't wait to help me question. And this is really about how you're relying on a trusted network of educators and partners to learn from case successes. So are you talking to that district administrator 2 counties over who had success with their literacy plan? The last question is kind of an across and through question, and it's about what elements of your program are interdisciplinary. So move across and throughout all of the subjects and ages and stages. So what we're going to do is kind of unpack an example from each one of these to illustrate how we're seeing schools who are effectively monitoring and implementing and continuously improving their literacy plan approaching this work. And I'm also going to share some examples from our own design and development process and how we approach this. So for the purposes of today, starting with that notion of establishing a common vocabulary, we're going to use the definition from ILA around literacy. So again, this idea of identifying and moving through communication of various types across any discipline in any context. And that's going to be how we ground our discussion around literacy for the purposes of the next 10 or 15 minutes. When we have that common definition, what we then start to think about is how we name and outline our system view. So how do we plan the work that's required, and how do we describe that work to our stakeholders in a way that everyone can really galvanize and begin to implement within the school or the district or districts, for example. And so this is an example of how we've approached our strategic literacy planning. And essentially we've devised a holistic approach that has 3 aspects of the design. So it starts with this notion of core literacy and what's required for core literacy. And then we've thought about elements of intervention and acceleration, and then how that plays out across purpose and essentially personalized learning elements of literacy systems. And those 3 aspects of design sit within what we see as 3 other dimensions that are comprised of curriculum, which is essentially the instructional materials, if you will, the professional development, and assessment. And it's these 6 elements together that are in service of goals of the system, right? How do you reach all learners? How do you instruct with intent? How do you engage and inspire? And so we often use this model to communicate clearly about the ecosystem for literacy as we imagine it to be, and it gives us a vehicle to discuss different models that we see in schools and districts. So once we have that sort of holistic approach and the theory of action, we start to begin by observing what is and adapting based on evidence to optimize and adapt that system. So in this instance, what we're going to look at is a very specific approach and theory of action around how we've thought about designing core curriculum. So in this instance, the example that I'd like to share is one from Reading Wonders. And so this is one of our core reading programs. And here, our theory of action included very specific protocols around things like text complexity and collaborative discussion and conducting research. And those research-based protocols were critical themes and threads and habits of mind throughout the program. And so when we think about areas around strengthening literacy development or how we look at our school policies and build leadership capacity in maybe non-ELA teachers' classrooms, those habits of mind in the core curriculum became key to addressing the entire ecosystem. So we had this theory of action around core curriculum that would manifest itself in a way at the level of implementation to support schools. Similarly, we thought about the intervention space and professional development. And in this example, our theory of action was really manifesting itself in a solution called direct instruction. And this is where we have a 2-pronged approach that includes initial implementation training followed by online support. And what you see in this program is the option for in-class coaching and online courses and professional development and learning environments that allow for professional learning communities on an ongoing basis. And it's really this idea of point of use, embedded, and beyond, so that when you think about how on-site support can be married with in-class coaching and can be married with virtual coaching and take advantages of the affordances of technology, you're wrapping the entire system around professional development so that you're providing strategy sessions with building administrators, for example, or academic coaches. So it's this notion of curriculum plus professional development and how that can be optimized. Another example for us is really around how we approach diagnostics and formative assessment. So we agree with Doug that that notion of data or records of experience is critical to helping you understand what to do next in the classroom. And this is an example where if you think about reading wonders and the theory of action that we had around things like text complexity, what we had to do was think about all the different types of evaluative moments where we had reading and writing connections, and we had quick checks and weekly unit assessments, and how we bring all of that data together in an actionable way so that we can think about students who are approaching level or beyond level, and how do we offer reports and results at the individual and class and district levels. And so we very much ran the reports and the data visualization through that same design and research process that I illustrated at the top of this section. And when we think about how all of those things come together, what we often try and do is utilize a case study and think deeply about how case studies can inform what we know about how theory translates to practice. And this is an example where we worked with a district administrator and a classroom principal who had been responsible for turning around 2 schools from the literacy perspective. And she sort of broke down her "who can't wait to help me" approach into 5 words. And so she talked about, again, that notion of having a common vision. And she talked about alignment of curriculum. And she told the story about how she walked from one mathematics classroom into a science classroom, and they were using definitions of mean, right? Mean, median, and mode. They had different definitions of mean. And she said, so we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to align our curriculum. And when we say mean in our science classrooms, we're going to define it in the same way we define mean in our mathematics classrooms. And that was one entry point for them developing a common vocabulary. When she talked about being deliberate, she talked about models and vertical teaming and this notion of bringing together the 9th grade math teacher with the 10th grade mathematics teacher and talking about that bridge between the two and how they were connecting. Ongoing for her was a marker around formative assessment. And she would often say the numbers will tell you what's wrong, but they don't tell you what to do. So we built out a data wall that turned into a data room where we actually had student pictures associated with that data so that we could have our professional development sessions in that room and look specifically at where each student needed to go next. She talked about comprehensive in terms of the professional development that occurred in those data rooms. And then when she talked about collaborative, it was about outreach. It was about going to a local university to say, could you help us with research projects to better understand ourselves? Do you have folks that are interested in internships at my site? She talked about working with local businesses to say, we need daily readers in these elementary classrooms. How can you help us? Looking at parent volunteers. So this was her construct and her framework, if you will, for approaching literacy systematically across those turnaround schools. One of the last notions that I would introduce here around those essential questions is the idea of any interdisciplinary element that is essential across all of your subjects. And so one of the examples I'm using here is actually a little bit rogue. I'm giving you a sneak peek at a forthcoming piece of research that my team is about to publish. So this is something I just walked through last week with the head of our English language development team. And what you can see on screen are guiding principles to support English language learners. And as you know, this is one of the fastest growing student populations in the country. And essentially what we've done is pull together the research in the form of principles that address things like cultivating meaning and teaching structure and form and developing language and context. And there's 9 principles that we've both applied and embedded within our design and development and also are suggesting are part of any critical literacy plan at schools and districts. So this is a bit of a stay tuned, and I definitely suggest that you reach out to us if you're interested in getting on the distribution list for the publication, because as I said, I kind of went a little rogue on the sneak preview. So just to kind of bring it to a close, we've talked about these common vocabulary and common definitions. So common language driving a common vision, and that being a critical and essential question. We've talked about how you name and frame the parts of your ecosystem. We've talked about how you can observe and adapt as you go so that you're testing your theory of action and its success. We've talked and shown you some examples about who can't wait to help me. How do you go to a trusted network and case studies from other schools or rely on universities and other partnerships that might extend your capabilities. And then we've also talked about what elements of our program are interdisciplinary and across and through. And so how do you support English language learners and bilingual education programs? So I want to be mindful of our time and leave us with a bit of time for Q&A. I know that if we don't have the opportunity to answer all the questions, that we will come back to those offline. But I will just sort of bring it full circle and really focus on this notion of purpose and understanding the problem you're trying to solve. Right? It wasn't that the soup was bad. It was that the tool and the spoon didn't exist and the communication broke down. So how do we think about defining a problem in a way that allows our mind to consider multiple options and really think about right tool, right time, right student for the right reason, and think about the broader context for literacy. So with that, I'm going to press pause and turn it over to our moderator for a bit of Q&A.
Thank you, Shawn, and thank you, Dr. Fisher, both of you. Fantastic, insightful presentations. We do have quite a few questions. We're going to get to as many as possible. Doug, one question came up from Jen that I want to make sure we address. Can you further clarify the difference between difficulty and complexity for everybody? Another example possibly for them. Doug? Okay.
Are you there?
I'll come back.
Are you there?
There you are. Okay, there you go. Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Me and my technology today. So I think I was saying that to a phone that wasn't working. I was saying that difficulty is about time and effort. It's how much kind of grit you have to put into something versus the kind of thinking that's required by something. Of course, there's an overlap between these two concepts, but things that require lots of cognitive steps or things that require you activate lots of background knowledge may not require a lot of time from you or a lot of grit. So there's a difference between things that we see kids, slog through and things that require them to get in their minds and really work out things. So I think of note-taking as a low difficulty, low complexity task. It's not a bad task. It's just not hard for most students, and it's not very complex for most students. I think of things like wide reading, where you expand their amount of reading time to be much more of a stamina kind of task. So it's not hard to read a book on your grade level, but it does take your time, and it does take your perseverance to stick with that book with the competing priorities of your cell phone ringing and all that kind of stuff. Problem-based learning, big projects tend to go up into the expertise kind of thing. So because they are unstructured, they are multiple solutions, they require reading across multiple documents, they tend to push both time, effort, and as well as the kind of thinking required. I hope that's helpful.
That's fantastic. A couple other questions ranged around the volume of reading. And, one question, Sherry had a question about how do we get kids to read at home and learn to love reading. And then we also had questions about rewards-based programs for getting students to read independently. Do you have any suggestions for that, or what have you seen that's worked in other schools?
So Linda Gambrell did a really interesting...
go ahead, sorry. My fault. Go ahead.
Linda Gambrell did a set of studies to get kids to read at home, and one of the things that improved at-home reading was what she called blessed books. So if a teacher holds up 3 to 5 books a day and says, here's why I like this book, here's the kind of reader who would like this book, here's why I like this next book, or here's an interesting thing about this next book, here's the kind of reader who would like this book. If a teacher does that blessed book phenomenon, they got significant changes in at-home reading because the teacher was having a system to recognize those kinds of books. When we have students have opportunities to have follow-up activities with the books they're reading at home, we see an increase. The studies that Nancy and I have done to get kids to read at home, especially adolescents, there were three big things that we noticed in the classrooms where kids read more at home. Number one, the teachers had a lot of choice. There wasn't just one book you all had to be reading at home. There was a significant amount of choice. Number two, there was an inquiry question that drove their at-home reading. So there were these big questions that drove like why we were reading something. And there were like things like, what's worth fighting for? What is beauty and or beautiful? There were these gigantic big questions. And the book lists were formed to help kids think about the answers to those questions. In some of the locations that we studied, the students generated the questions and then the teachers generated the books to get to those questions. In other places, the questions were determined by the staff, either the curriculum or the teachers, and then there were choices for books. So again, choice and then an inquiry focus. And then the third thing we saw in classrooms that read a lot is that teachers modeled their own reading. They would read excerpts out loud for students from their own things they were reading and then think aloud. And when we saw those three things happen in practice, we saw significantly more at-home reading volume.
Excellent. Those are great tips. Thanks, Doug. All right, everyone. I want to thank everyone for attending. And I know some of you still have questions out there lingering. We will definitely respond to you in the next week or two with answers from Doug or some of our experts with the questions you have. They're all fantastic. But we do all want to thank you all for attending the webinar today. And thank you, Doug and Shawn, for your presentation. They're fantastic. Everyone on the call will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a PDF of those great slides. Okay, like I said earlier, if we didn't get your question, we will follow up with you individually. And thanks, everyone, again for attending. We had a wonderful turnout and great participation. Have a great day and rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.